to him. History had shown that the best works in literature, in arts, were after a serious crisis. And every crisis was perceived by people, the optimists, as opportunity. For example, we have, after the Second World War, the best movies, world classics, movies like Bicycle Thieves, Life is Beautiful, Schindler's List. I don't want to elaborate on this point. So, several of the best works in literature, in arts, have come because of the experience of a calamity or because of a disaster, because of the experiences of utter poverty, of acute unemployment as a consequence of a historical circumstance. So I am very happy that at this particular juncture, when the whole world is in a serious crisis, we who are perceived as opinion leaders wherever we are going to think together on the topic of the cultural lockdown from a literature perspective. It's a matter of pride that a seasoned resource person is going to address us. He is a known author, a translator, and a speaker. He currently works as an assistant professor at the Department of English, Government College, Mokeri, in Calicut district. He finished his PhD in Cultural Studies from the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. He worked with the Faculty of Humanities at NIT Warangal before shifting to Kerala in 2010. He worked with International Shakespearean Desk, Dublin, on localizing Shakespeare. Dr. Arunlal has written and published widely on issues concerning culture, philosophy, and literature. And he has contributed articles in several international journals, including the Literary Criterion. And his research article, Spatial Logics in Poetry, was the cover article of the International Journal of European Studies in 2017. He himself has done the translation of one of the known short story writers in Kerala, Akbar Kakkatil's stories. He has currently 4 books to his credit. He has also brought out the translation of Bertrand Russell in 2014, and it was Penguin has published his collection of poems in 2015. He has contributed 2 entries to the forthcoming Encyclopedia of Aesthetics and Poetics from Sahitya Academy. He has worked as an assistant director of 2 documentary films. He is a member of the panel of resource persons for UGC HRDC Kerala University, a member of Board of Studies in Calicut University, and he is also a research guide in Calicut University. So I'm very happy that he is available to speak very authoritatively on the topic pandemic and cultural lockdown from military.
Thank you, Father. I'd welcome Dr. Arunlal Mokeri, our resource person, for handling the webinar. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Anaka. Thanks, Father. And hi, Sharad. So, as the inaugural address was trying to say, I'm not going to speak authoritatively on the literary perspective towards, this pandemic COVID-19. I don't think we are in a position to make any authoritative comments about the situation as of yet, because the situation hasn't left us. Once something is part of history, once a disease, a war, a crisis, a global economic decline, while these things are part of history, we have perspectives about it, clear-cut authoritative perspectives about it. But as long as they are part of our present, as long as they have not been solved, as long as there are still problems for us to address, it is difficult to develop an authoritative perspective about them. So what I'll be doing is I'll be giving you tentative, I will be giving you in the sense that we'll be developing together a tentative perspective from the dimension of readers and writers of literature. I'll consider ourselves as readers of literature, writers of literature, and then that is how we'll proceed with the webinar talk. I'll talk around 45 minutes, and then I'll wait for you to respond. I'll take your questions, I'll take your comments, I'll take your expectations, and we'll develop this perspective that I'm thinking of developing. Okay. With that prefatory note, let me go into what I have in my hand. Usually I don't have things in my hand before I start speaking because I'll still be thinking about it. Fortunately for this webinar, I have this 2-page thing with me, and I should thank the author Arunlal, who is going to bring out a collection of pandemic short fiction very soon. A few days back, he called me up and he said, they were planning to bring out a collection of stories, a collection of short fiction based on the pandemic experience across India. And I think a few contributors are from outside India as well. So they were trying to bring together an anthology. They planned to call it Notions of Healing. And Anu thought I would be the best person, as far as he is concerned. He thought I would be the best person to give him a preface for his book. And he sent me the stories. So, a collection that has some 19 stories in it. So he sent me the collection. He asked me to, do a preface for him, an introductory, part, where I'll be talking about, or I should be talking about, the literary angle, the literary perspective that we could use for understanding the pandemic situation, the COVID situation. That is how I sat down to put this on paper. And that is why we have this paper. I wouldn't call this a research paper. This is just this is technically, this is a preface. This is a preface I have written for the collection of short stories that Arunlal is going to bring out very soon. It will be in the market very soon. They are trying to put together stories from different places, different states in India, from across India, and a few stories from outside India. They're trying to put it together. They're calling it Notions of Healing. Healing in the sense like curing. Notions of healing. As healing is a word that we usually use in connection with literary writing and literary reading. So we are going to enter this preface that I have made to go before people who read a collection of stories that describe the experience of people, experience of writers as they face the pandemic. And it's not new, right? We have seen poetry like from KGS, from Sachidanandan. The major poets from India have responded to the pandemic situation. The Instagram is full of Insta poems from Nikita Gill, from Rupi Kaur, people who have been like famous and Insta celebs. They have been writing poetry. So poetry has severally addressed. Short fiction is coming up. I mean, this is basically a preface for the short fictions. Okay, short stories are coming up. I'm sure fiction will also follow. There will be fiction. There will be novels written about the pandemic experience, the COVID-19 experience very soon. So, we'll be having a feasible body of literature soon about the way we have experienced, the way we experience uh, the COVID-19 situation. Maybe this is one, this is just one aspect of the literary perspective. So you have a crisis and people who write respond to it. But you very well know that it is not necessary that writers should respond to what is happening in the society. Like if something is happening in the society, it is not the responsibility of the writer to suddenly seize the moment and start giving a commentary. That is not what literature does. If a pandemic happens, it is the freedom of it is the entitlement of the writer to decide whether he or she should choose to respond or not. There is always a choice, and it is not compulsory that a writer should definitely write something about the COVID situation. Recently M. Mukundan had said, I mean, people were like calling him up and asking him, so what exactly is your response to COVID-19? There is no response to COVID-19 that could be ready-made offered from a literary person. But and that is what is special about literature, right? This is not how it works in other disciplines. Like think of, for instance, trade experts. The trade expert has to compulsorily give a perspective on COVID-19. The economist has to say something about the COVID situation. Like the medical experts. So that's how I began the preface. So I'll read out this particular script. I mean, I'll basically be reading out from this script, and in between I'll do some diversions. That is the plan. The COVID-19 pandemic has spawned commentaries from all sides. We have the medical experts offering comparisons with the previous pandemic outbreaks and keeping us on the edge about the development of an effective vaccine that can inoculate us against the coronavirus. Even louder, we hear the commentaries of economists trying to parse, comprehend, contextualize, and repair the damage the lockdowns have brought to the world economies. Bad politicians are into mudslinging and blame games, while the good ones are trying to bring some sort of order in the social chaos that increases day by day. Trade experts and entrepreneurs are looking at what is on the wane and what is waxing at the commercial horizon. But see, you see, the point is, people who are not, literary, people who are not readers or writers of literature, people who are scientists, technologists, economists, commerce experts, trade experts, people who are politicians. It is incumbent on them. It is necessary that they should leave a response. They should come out with some sort of solution. They should some kind of commentary, some kind of solution, some kind of responses necessitated from their part. But as far as literature is concerned, it seems literature is above this. Literature is above everything, for that matter. It doesn't have to respond to anything that happens to human world in general. It can choose to, choose not to. So we need to develop our perspective from this. This is the bedrock. This is the fundamental. This is the fundamental axiomatic kind of block that we have, from which we should develop our perspective. So, is there a way in which we can look at the pandemic from our position as a reader or a writer or a reader-writer of literature? Is there a perspective? Can we develop this perspective? If we develop this perspective, what kind of effect would it take in our reading of literature in further decades, in the other centuries? Literature is not a dead site. It is a live, organic site from which every experience that has been recorded as literature, every crisis that has been responded to in a literary manner, it trickles down, it infiltrates. There is a permeable membrane between genres, between literary periods, between literary sensibilities. It's not like one literary sensibility appears at one point in history and it is sealed off forever. No, it could be renewed. It will be revisited. Like you have the Journal of the Plague Year, written by Daniel Defoe. We revisit Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year in order to understand how people experienced pandemic in the beginning of 17th century. Or we go to Chaucer and see how the plague was responded to by people. Or we go to Boccaccio, or we go to Shakespeare, or we go back in time, we find out people who have responded to the pandemic in a roundabout fashion or in a direct fashion. People who have written poetry about pandemics, people who have written poetry regarding diseases. We get back to Keats, John Keats. We find that John Keats was somebody who was acutely suffering from complications that tuberculosis basically makes in human body. And every single poem of John Keats can be understood as a response to the way in which TB has been felt by that particular poet, how he has been segregated, how he has been shut down in a sanatorium, how he was able to perceive. Why do you think the romantic poet John Keats would be acutely aware of approaching death? Because he was in a sanatorium. He was in the presence of people who were coughing, hawking, spitting blood. So this proximity with death and the fancies that are associated usually with the state of consumption. This is working in almost all the poems. Look at Ode to Nightingale, for instance. Look at Ode to Psyche. Look at Grecian Urn, for instance. You will find that this associate, the Keatsian association of death with the permanence of art, stuff like that. He actually derives that perspective. He crafts his perspective on death, disease, permanence of art from positioning himself as a diseased person, as an ill person, as somebody who's part of a large community infected by TB. Even though we say Keats suffers as an individual, even though we say in Romanticism, individualism is so important, maybe, that theory bypasses or brushes aside the reality that Keats was not just one person. Keats was not experiencing that pain. Keats was not experiencing this approaching that kind of a feeling. He was not feeling it as one person. He was feeling it as an inmate of a sanatorium. He was feeling it as one among a large number of people who were infected with TB during that period. Tuberculosis was a pandemic. It was a pandemic, as you know. Susan Sontag has written an entire book on it, Illness as Metaphor, where she painstakingly describes how there were larger cultural associations about TB. She also tries to show us that TB was popularized by the Princess del Joseph, for instance. There are several other people, Chopin, for instance, people who valorized TB, people who thought that TB could happen, TB could come only if you were chosen. So the chosen people, I'm chosen so that I'm contracted by TB. If you have read Andrew Sinclair's biography of Dylan Thomas was obsessed by this particular idea that he will contract TB. He thought himself as a follower of, as the heir of, descendant of John Keats. Okay, and Dylan Thomas thought that he'll die before he is 30, and he'll definitely die because he'll contract TB. He kind of prayed that TB come to him. Can you imagine that? Somebody who wishes so much. There is a way in which TB becomes fashionable. I'm not bluffing. Anybody who has gone through illness as a metaphor will definitely understand what I'm trying to say. TB was a fashionable disease. The pale, thin figures infected by TB. People whose insides were transparent. If you have read Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, you will remember how Hans Castorp and all his friends in that sanatorium, they proudly wear their X-rays on their chest. So after every X-ray, they'll wear their X-rays on their chest. The thing is, they looked at themselves as becoming increasingly transparent. These were cultural myths, actually. These were cultural myths. It's not that your body becomes transparent because you're a TB patient. It doesn't. We know that it doesn't happen. Practically, it doesn't happen. So, but then mythically, they thought they are more transparent. They are more affected by emotion. Catherine Mansfield was a TB patient. Kafka was a TB patient. Keats was a TB patient. We have we have a considerable body of writers who were infected by TB in 18th and 19th century. And if you remember, by 1850, germ theory was already developing. I mean, Louis Pasteur comes into the scene, and then we are given this idea that diseases are basically because diseases happen to us because there are germs, and these germs could actually be seen through microscopes, and there could be vaccines that trigger that trigger some kind of antibody production in our own physique. It is possible for us to have vaccines that can help us fight pathogens that enter our body. So these were scientific realities as early as 1850. But even in the middle of 20th century, in 1940s, in 1950s, Dylan Thomas would believe that TB is some kind of godsend. See, diseases are not understood exclusively as medical realities. That is the whole point. We do not understand an illness as an exclusive medical reality. A disease is a holistic reality, especially a pandemic. A pandemic is an economic reality. A pandemic is a political reality. A pandemic is a medical reality too. So you see, we develop our perspective of pandemics. We develop our perspective about COVID-19 by understanding or by putting together all this perspective and then writing about it as a literary person. Literature is not free from these discussions. Literature uses certain kernel logics, certain core logics, certain fundamental blocks borrowed from, customized from the discussions that I have just now commented on. It puts these things together and then tries to develop an idiom through which these things could be addressed. But getting back to the discussion, death, diseases, and decadence were themes for literary writers since, well, death is something that fascinated literary writing ever since literature was, conceived. One of the major themes that almost all the major literary writers have tried to grapple with is death, and then disease, and decadence also. So this angle in literature is important for us. We'll be discussing more about this. There are other angles: happiness, sexuality, pleasure, physicality. There is another a whole different dimension of literature that we could look at some other point of time. In this discussion, we'll be looking at how literature, as a beginning point towards the development of a perspective regarding COVID-19. Perhaps we should, angle ourselves. We should position ourselves as concerned exclusively with how death, disease, and decadence were narrated in literature. How did literature come? How did literature address in its century, millennia-long evolution? How did literature contextualize? How did literature comment upon something like a block like death, disease, and decadence? Okay, these aspects, death, disease, and decadence, were closely connected in literature of earlier periods to curses and the wrath of gods. Well, we are going to the flashback. Look at all those foundational texts. Look at epics, for that matter. You may remember, Iliad begins with Apollo shooting his small arrows. These small arrows are arrows of plague. So the gods are sitting in the heaven and they're trying to release arrows of plague. So like arrows, like a rain of arrows, plague will come and fall down onto a city. This is how Iliad begins. In the beginning of Iliad, you have the scene where Apollo is busy shooting arrows. So from the epics down to, say, the Semitic religious texts, foundational texts of Semitic religions, you would find a certain idea that diseases are basically divine departments. Diseases are imparted to the human world by gods. Gods decide who has to be sick, who has to fall ill, which community, which city has to be destroyed, what kind of curse, what kind of disease must be sent to a certain community, must be sent to a certain city. Like if there is a city of homosexuals, what kind of curse should fall on that city? If there is a city that has a king who has killed his father and had made children with his mother, what kind of disease should infect that city? This is up to the gods to decide. And when the gods decide, and when the gods send the curse, then we humans try to atone for the sins. And atonement of sins, once accepted by the gods, the disease slowly leaves the place. Now, this is the paradigm from which everything actually begins. This is where everything begins. The first, notions, the earliest notions in literature about disease had to do a lot with gods. And later in the paper, later in the preface, the script that I have written, I can't call this a paper, this is a preface. So in this paper, in this script that I have written, I'll also come across how epistemologically there is a problem when you talk about Oedipus, right? Or a work like Iliad. Okay, in the West, the epics Iliad and Odyssey have many subplots where the gods send plagues and poxes to the cities that they curse. In a significant trophy in the Iliad cycle of stories, Oedipus's very existence in Thebes calls down the curse of plague on the city. The evil that men do were checked by diseases sent from the high heavens. In the East, too, in several episodes of Mahabharata and Ramayana, we see the curse of disease, illness, pandemics, falling upon gross sinners. So if there is a sinner, like for instance, you take up the range of diseases extends from festering skin diseases to blindness to infirmity and leprosy. So you will find in Mahabharata also, especially in Mahabharata, less so in Ramayana. In Mahabharata, you will find several instances where Krishna curses somebody with a disease, where gods are awful and they send diseases to a certain community. You will find several episodes in Mahabharata where it is done. Now, at the outbreak of the range of diseases extend from festering skin diseases to blindness, infirmity, and leprosy. India's subaltern religious mythologies generally have smallpox personified as a goddess. So if you check into there is a Mahabharata, Ramayana, leave that. Stepping outside that, still you would find that in most of the tribal clans, in most of the tribal godheads, you would find that people believe that diseases usually have a god. Pox will have a god. Like for instance, smallpox is usually personified as a goddess, the goddess Kali, Mari. That is how it's addressed in Malayalam. In Malayalam, the word for smallpox goddess, or the name of the goddess who controlled the outbreak of smallpox happens to be Mari. They look at the etymology of that particular term. It's like great, Maha. Ari is etymologically that means enemy. Maha Ari is Mari. It's like the great enemy. So the great enemy becomes a god. The great enemy is great enemy because you don't have any weapons against this enemy. The human world has no weapon against this enemy, and therefore this enemy is a great enemy, Mari. And Mari is a goddess. If you check into Kerala's folklore, you would find several hymns, several songs, several prayers addressing Mari, asking Mari to leave the village. So Mari will bring smallpox to a village, and then the death of the villagers, the death of the tribal people, the death of the people in a community, that is seen as the dance of Mari. Dance in the sense of blood bath, the blood bath and dance of Mari. No, in Jisha says Mahabharata talks about. I skipped it. I'll come back to the comments like after I present this short piece of script that I have written. Well, Ravi, if you remember O.V. Vijayan's Khasakinte Idihasam, one of the primary modernist text of Malayalam literature, Legends of Kasak, as it has been translated by Vijayan himself. Uh, that book actually has that episode where smallpox breaks out in Kasak, and the villagers, they die like flies. As flies to the wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport, says Shakespeare in King Lear. And King Lear also is a key text that we will come to later. King Lear also has this enormous obsession with diseases and the wrath of gods. We will need to think about that. We will definitely take up King Lear for discussion in a while. At this point, I want you to look at this reference. At the outbreak of pox, there will be services at the shrine of the tribal or village goddess. The epidemic, the death from the epidemic was understood as a bloodbath and dance of the goddess. In biblical literature also, diseases were understood as the wrath of the god. Death and diseases were part of the primal curse that Adam and Eve brought upon mankind. But there are specific cities that the Old Testament God chooses to destroy with specific pestilences and diseases. According to the types and intensity of the sins, the God chose types and intensities of the diseases that will be sent to the cities. As I have told you, if there is a homosexual city, there is a certain kind of pestilence. If there is a city that is a sin of adultery, there will be another kind of disease. So, like how each crime has its own punishment, each sin had its own disease. Disease was something like a curse. Disease was something like a methodology that divine intervention will adopt so as to cure the mankind or warn the mankind rather, or terrify the mankind rather. The mankind is helpless, disarmed. No, the mankind doesn't have weapons to fight these great enemies. So these great enemies were godsends, or they were interventions from the divine into the mundane world that we inhabit. Well, this is how literature looked at it in the beginning. The original reason for associating deadly diseases and pandemics with God was that these, like many other natural phenomena then, were inexplicable to human logic, like thunder or flood or storm or famine. These diseases were also beyond the scope of explanation and were understood as God sends. There was awe, and then there is always this aura of a mystery. So the miraculous dimensions were attached to diseases, and there were no effective cures for many of them. Definitely, we are talking about that particular time. The aura or the mystery surrounding diseases, it started dissipating with the advancement of modern medicine. To be precise, with the development of modern germ theory in 1850 and the discovery of pathogens as responsible for most of the deadly diseases, the mystery was finally done away with. But in place of, it's not like mystery is completely done away with. When mystery leaves the idea of disease, cultural mythology steps in. And that is when you have TB being understood as a mythical disease, as a romantic disease, as a disease that could be read together with certain states of mind. I've come to that point where Susan Sontag tries to illustrate the point. You have as Susan Sontag, F.M.D. Giacomo, or Umberto Eco, and several other literary theorists, okay, they point out diseases like tuberculosis went on to retain romantic conceits about them even after it was medically proven that the disease was a bacilli infection. Even in the middle of the 20th century, the Western world believed that TB affects people who have a certain state of mind and a certain heritage, and that contracting TB was a prospect that brought glamour to death. Sontag elaborates in Illness as a Metaphor that TB was understood. I'm quoting from Sontag. This is from Illness as a Metaphor. TB was understood as a manner of appearing, and that appearance became a staple of 19th century manners. It became rude to eat heartily. It was glamorous to look sickly. It was glamorous to look sickly. Now look at the cult of thin bodies. If you look into the paintings of Raphael, if you look into the classic paintings, you would always find that the female body is stout, fat even. But this fat, stout female bodies were completely out of the ideal figure category of painters, visual artists from 19th century onwards. They started painting females who were thin. So you have this, what is it, the hourglass figure and all those things basically are products of TB. Who is this female who is thin? Who's this thin female we are talking about? We're talking about the TB infected female, the sickly, thin, somebody who was almost, sick, almost at the verge of becoming a phantom. That kind of a female. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about a thin female. When we're talking about the kind of ideal figure. When we're talking about people who have an hourglass figure. Where does this come from? Where exactly did this begin? Well, this began in 19th century with certain associations of aesthetics with TB-infected bodies. She makes it clear. Sontag continues. Sontag actually refers to Camille Saint-Saëns, who wrote in 1913 how it was fashionable to be ill at the time. I'm quoting from, Camille Saint-Saëns. This is from 1913. So we have her observation. It was fashionable to be pale and drained. Princess Belgiojoso, I have already made a mention of that princess in the beginning of my presentation, if you remember. Princess Belgiojoso strolled along the boulevards, pale as death in person. Now, this princess contributed heavily in making the tubercular look a new fashion. See, the tubercular look, there is something called the tubercular look. you say the workout kind of look. We have all kinds of looks, right? In 19th century, there came up this look called tubercular look. The tubercular look became fashionable because the princess was infected by tuberculosis. And after getting infected by tuberculosis, she would make it a point to go out in the boulevards, the streets. And then, the way she carries herself off, the way she recites poetry from her mind, the way she writes poetry, the way she appreciates art, creates art. It made this impression. It made this popular, fashionable cult of TB, tubercular body. Tubercular body became a fashion. The thin body became a fashion. The fat body was outdated. It became out of fashion. Well, the princess contributed heavily in making the tubercular look a new fashion. Sontag, I'm getting back to Sontag, writes, the TB-influenced idea of the body was a new model for aristocratic looks. At a moment when aristocracy stops being a matter of power and starts being mainly a matter of image. That's a very interesting idea that Sontag is talking about. She's talking about how aristocracy has lost its power. An aristocrat is not somebody who wields power. An aristocrat is somebody who looks like an aristocrat. Aristocrat is a product of the mark. So as and when this became a matter of image, at that point of time in history, the TB-influenced idea of the body was a new model for aristocratic looks. At a moment when aristocracy stops being a matter of power and starts being mainly a matter of image. The association of tuberculosis with literature is in itself a whole body of writing in modern literary theory. So if you really bother to check, you will find that there is a whole body of writing out there in literary theory that discusses how TB is associated with literature. And TB is associated with a certain look, a certain popular cultural metaphor. Well, the infected people were thought to be more sensitive to emotional stimuli, and therefore they were destined to be poetic. Poets such as Dylan Thomas anticipated a death by tuberculosis. I'm using Andrew Sinclair's biography of Dylan Thomas to basically furnish this fact. If you read through the biography, you will find how Andrew Sinclair looked at the obsession that Dylan Thomas had regarding contracting TB. Contracting TB was some kind of he thought, contracting TB is like the best thing that could happen to him, because Keats died of TB. Because he wanted to be known as somebody who wrote like Keats, carried off himself like Keats, and died like Keats. Strange, but true. And he had a premonition. He wrote in his diary that he'll die before he is 30 and he'll die of consumption. Keats's Death by TV had influenced Thomas in a very deep manner. It is another thing that Thomas went on to live beyond 30. Well, Thomas did not die at 30 anyways. Like, let's leave that point. Let's come down to the next idea. As the popular mythology surrounding TB slowly assimilated into the 20th century popular culture, cancer and its metaphors started taking roots. Sontag correlates the emergent cultural associations of cancer. Now, Sontag herself was a cancer patient. Remember that? So Sontag correlates the emergent cultural associations of cancer with a core shift in capitalism and statecraft. In the system that Sontag delineated, there is a sequence of modern illnesses and their metaphors beginning from TB, moving on to cancer, and then AIDS. The world has seen more pandemics since that point of time. In Sontag's system, she begins with tuberculosis, she advances to cancer, and then she comes to AIDS, and she AIDS and its metaphors. That's the last that set. So she stops there. But after AIDS, we have had several other pandemics. So maybe we need to ask comes from different parts of the globe. We should probably also think about what happens to, the sequence of illnesses, the sequence of pandemics, Ebola, SARS, Spanish flu, and perhaps the word that set the whole world in an unprecedented crisis is COVID-19. The linearity or the sequence nature at a given time, literature uses the content from an earlier pandemic context to advance a newer range of metaphors. The metaphors that the COVID outbreak has generated and their assimilation that is happening in the global living context now will in turn define newer kernels for literature to operate with. And this is where this is basically the breaking point in the development of a perspective. When we think of developing a perspective, when we think of molding a certain vision regarding pandemic from nature's point of view, this is perhaps very important. Has generated and their assimilation that is happening in the global living context now will define newer kernels for literature to operate with. This is where we link literature with pandemic. The pandemic puts in place premises for a newer epistemic, ontological, psychological, sociological, and theodictic contingencies. And what is literature but a capital flourish of imagination from these 5 quarters? So when you're looking at pandemic and the situation that the pandemic has found, you will see that the pandemic has put a newer psychological, a newer sociological, and a newer theodictic contingency. And literature is nothing but a flourish of imagination that works on epistemology, ontology, psychology, how we link a pandemic situation with a literary perspective. Literature's epistemological inquiries move in the direction of how much humans can actually know. As we have seen in the case of ethics and other foundational texts, when the limit of inquiry stopped at the idea of God, literature actively tried to probe the limit. In Oedipus Rex, for instance, we are made to confront the divine decision to make Oedipus suffer for sins that he committed without a sinful intent. By making the protagonist a puppet of fate, whose suffering appears grossly disproportionate, Sophocles, there are so many Oedipus writers, but let's take up Sophocles' version. Sophocles and other Oedipus writers, definitely, from ancient Greece, they made the genre of tragedy stand against the limits of that which could be known. I want us to revisit that part of the presentation. I began with saying that, when the plague hits Thebes because Oedipus lives in Thebes and Oedipus is a sinner. But there is a catch. It's not as easy as that. It works in a slightly different manner. See, Oedipus Rex is a tragedy. And, when we discuss the tragic flow of Oedipus, we are at a loss to find any tragic flow. Because Oedipus is not suffering because he has committed something that is grievously sinful. I mean, he did commit something that is sinful, but he committed that not because he has an error in character, but because the fate wanted him to be so. The fate, he's a puppet, a pawn in the hands of destiny, in the hands of fate. So what is the epistemological reality that Oedipus Rex is trying to communicate to us? At a time when diseases were godsends. So the limit of the probe, the limit of the inquiry stopped at gods. Now Oedipus Rex is trying to problematize the way the limit ends at a God. Oedipus Rex is trying to problematize diseases as godsend by using the non-sinful nature or the non-erratic nature of Oedipus. Oedipus is only trying to find out the truth. All through the play of Sophocles, he is trying to find out the truth. What actually is the reason? He is convinced that he is not the sinner, because consciously this person has not done any harm to anyone. He has only realized whatever his duties as a king or a citizen should be. The murder of Laius or the marriage with Jocasta was incidental as far as Oedipus is concerned. But as far as the fate is concerned, we have fashioned Oedipus's life in such a fashion, in such a manner that he will become a victim of something that is absolutely tragic. So this is the epistemological issue that Oedipus Rex is bringing before us. I'm just taking Oedipus Rex as an example. You could take any text from that particular point. You could take a Ashwadhama story, for instance. Ashwadhama was cursed by Sri Krishna. Ashwadhama was cursed in the sense like a psoriatic skin. He'll have festering wounds all over his body, and he'll roam the earth for 3,000 years. A curse of a disease. But Ashwadhama was only doing his duty. How just was Sri Krishna in cursing him? How just was the god who cursed Oedipus? So, this is what literature does. Literature is trying to epistemologically, fight, struggle. Literature is not going to take an answer for granted. Literature wants to question. Epistemologically tries to, it pushes the limit. It pushes the epistemologic limit. And the divine ratifications for the plague were brought under the scanner of humanist free will. In the myths of Ashwadhama, I have just told that, let's skip it. With the advancement of science by 19th century, we see a whole new genre of literature, namely science fiction, emerging. Now, as we come down, it's not like the answers were always ending with the god. The trend of blaming everything on God or blaming everything on fate that ends in 19th century, definitely with the emergence of modern science, because we found gravity was there, germs were there, things which were not present in Oedipus, things which were not present to the writer of Mahabharata or Ramayana, they were present in 19th century. They were present in 18th century. Gravity was present, germs were present, currents were present, the weather was explicable, the sea was predictable, cartography was universal. So, things changed. And in 19th century, you therefore have an entire branch of new fiction emerging, science fiction emerging. So you see, the epistemologic probings of science fiction will be absolutely wonderful, right? So when you move into an epistemologic inquiry with science or scientific rationality as the driving force, you will be moving in a totally different tangent from Oedipus Rex or Mahabharata or Odyssey or any of the classic epic or foundational texts. So this is something that is interesting. So you see the genre's fascination with the secrets of the infinitesimally small germs, as well as the unimaginably big galactic spaces, reconfigured the limits and possibilities of what we know and what we can know. Literature outside science fiction also started drawing from the genre's adjusting of the epistemic bar. So the epistemic bar was raised in 19th century, or it was readjusted in some manner. In fiction, in poetry, in dramas and life writing globally, the epistemic inquiry is readjusted to the frames of scientific knowledge. From Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to Huxley's Brave New World to Amitav Ghosh's Calcutta Chromosome and further, there emerged a feasible body of literary fiction that angled with new scientific rationality and new urbanity. And now the ontological dimension. I said epistemology is the ontology is the right. So the ontological dimension, what happens to the ontological dimension in literary perspective? The ontological dimension of literary perspective, which basically means trying to figure out who we are. That's basically the ontological question that literature is interested in. What exactly are we? Who are we? Is also informed by humanity's twist with the large-scale pandemic. The romantic temperament that was implied by tuberculosis is a case in point. In classics like Man's Magic Mountain, Theodore Hans Castorp finally starts analyzing life in its nuances and Proustian details. In Proustian details, the novel builds the aesthetics of a mind-stimulating. Castorp echoes the emotional reality of being human. On the other side of this, the fearsome and agitated end of the ontological question. I mean, a pandemic may put you in a lockdown, may lock you down in a quarantine. And what can a quarantine do? A quarantine can work in two ways. When you are in a quarantine, you will get enough time to look. You will get enough time to analyze your feelings. You will get enough time to be, curious about how life has been. On the other side, a quarantine can be damaging, emotionally damaging. So, that's also something that has been addressed by literature. The other side of this, the fearsome and agitated end of the ontological question, can be seen addressed in novels like Saramagos's Blindness, in Crichton's or Orwell's or Samyathin's dystopian novels. You would basically find them addressing the case of post-human ontologies. Since we look at Orwell's 1984 or look at Crichton's Westworld, you will find that they're addressing post-human ontologies, ontologies which are radically different from ontological questions that happen to be posed in pre-18th century or pre-17th century narratives. So we come to that. In these contexts, we find that humanness as such is seen as a disease and debilitation. In a post-human context, in a post-human ontology, being a human is understood as weakness. Being a human is understood as some kind of sickness, disease, illness. I mean, if you have read Zamyatin's We, if you have read Brave New World by Huxley, you definitely know what I'm talking about. They consider, in those novels, basically consider humans to be a flawed species. And post-human ontology basically realize the actual possibilities and potential. So being human is, you need to advance and become post-human. So literature starts probing into that. It's pushing. Literature is pushing the possibilities. And the very idea of a disease is being radically rethought in literature in 20th century, especially the post-human fantasies that were, crafted in 20th century. So there is a deep-seated wish to transcend the human body and human sensibilities, since they are primarily human weaknesses. Intellect and its ability to predict the future or specific outcomes precisely become the cornerstone in understanding the post-human. Everything that was hailed as creative and spontaneous and spiritual in human selves in the previous centuries was just information that was not properly copied and backed up. Crichton goes to the extent of marking the human mind, I'm quoting from Westworld, as the last analog device in a digital world. What is your mind? Your mind is the last analog device in a digital world. The world has become digital. Your mind is the last analog device. An obsolescence, we wouldn't even, somebody going to lemon. Proceeding. When we try to arrive at a perspective from the literary point of view, we need to also be cognizant about the psychological both these cases, the individual's body, family, community, or even national boundaries are exceeded. Recording the mind's back has been a major operative logic of modern literature. Being psychologically precise was even seen as a virtue in the modernist model. In fact, that was the very ambition of avant-garde literary devices such as the stream of consciousness. Recording the mental ramblings of a deceased mind constitutes a tangent of comprehending such heavy works of modernist slash postmodern midnight children. This style of literary writing, namely magical realism, is inherently psychological and seeks to address larger sociological conditions such as dictatorships. The doyen of magical realist writings, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, uses the motif of an epidemic in one of his best-known works, Love in the Time of Cholera. Cholera outbreak becomes a background in minds of death in such works. In a stride, basically session. My disease is not just my disease. I am ill. My family is ill. The community that I live in, that is ill. The nation and the globe as such. There is a way in which your disease correlates something, signifies something much larger than you as an individual body. And that is that's a that is we COVID positive, then it's not just me. I will be quarantined. My family will be quarantined. There is a village that could actually become a containment zone, and this containment zone is part of containment zones that are marked across the globe. In Texas, in US, has today become the site where maximum number of COVID positive patients are. Texas for COVID. There is a sociological extension that runs between these two spaces. A totally different angle to discuss, but I'm just showing how literature would work in all those interstitial spaces. Well, John Milton thought this his epic should justify. I'm coming to the last point. We are going to theodicy. So when you discuss theodicy, definitely we need to, one of the major points that we usually pick up, perhaps the most important problem that we have to put in perspective when we discuss theodicy is, of course, John Milton. So we begin the last part of the discussion with Milton. So Milton thought his epic should justify the ways of God to men. God, destiny, there is always this overwhelming. So this is another question. This is another dimension in which literary perspectives need to be understood. Okay, how exactly? Why is this happening? Stephen Greenblatt, in his Shakespearean Negotiations, shows how the bard was intrigued with the diseases and the cures. Greenblatt links up King Lear and the tragedy's heavy angle on diseases with the way Renaissance Protestant politicians sought to downplay the Catholic exorcist activities which were rife in England during the time. This is another point that I wanted to bring in today's discussion, how Shakespeare, especially King Lear, the tragedy of King Lear, how Shakespeare was intrigued, bodily, he was constantly trying to refer to that are responsible for bringing diseases into human bodies. Where did he get this elaborate vocabulary of demonism, like possession? Greenblatt, gives you that idea. With this. In 1603, Samuel Hansnet wrote a declaration of egregious popish impostures. The writing of King Lear coincided with the publishing of this book. Evidences suggest that Shakespeare had read Hansnet's book and the moral universe of King Lear, replete with the infirm king's rants and curses which imitate exorcist idioms, was extrapolated from a declaration. Now, Greenblatt shows how Shakespeare's pro-Protestant views of diseases, as in diseases are not holy possessions, etc., was endemic. So this is basically with seeing how beyond theodicy, beyond sociology, beyond psychology, we need to think of other dimensions. Like maybe we should think of the whole situation as readers of literature. We've been talking from the angle of writers. We've been talking from the angle of text till now. Maybe we should also think of literature as a reader's exercise. In that sense, in effect, a literary perspective on pandemic will include readings, debate, mentions like also consider the aspect of reading alongside with writing. The possibilities of hosting literature online, for instance, needs to be looked at as a COVID-19 and the rise of social media, where publishing is not mediated by editors or physical distribution chains. They mark a significant break from earlier centuries of reading. The cause and effect of this phenomenon will be clear to us only in the coming years. But nonetheless, it is safe to say that a very different kind of literacy, reading culture, and book market is already in place, and that we are all gazing at the looming immanence of the digitality of literature, if not the digitality of humanities as a whole. So I rest my paper here. Now we can move on to the questions. We can
Thank you so much, sir. That was very informative session from your side. So those who have questions can type it down in the chat box, or you may even switch on your microphone and ask it directly. Arjun sir, so the first question is, does the miasma theory, which was in usage during the Black Death, mean the same as the germ theory? Sir? We are very sorry. We think there's a technical problem from Arun sir's side. So participants, please wait for a while.
I'm back online.
So am I audible?
You are audible. My phone was running on low battery. I tried plugging it up to a charger and I think I got logged out.
Okay, sir. It's fine. So, sir, the first question is, does the miasma theory, which was in usage during the Black Deaths, mean the same as the germ theory? The question is by Ninu Thomas.
See, germ theory has a long history, a very long history. But let us not try to, use the prehistory of like miasma theory and humor theory. All those things basically were used in Renaissance when microscope was not discovered. The proper germ theory, when we understand what we understand now when we say germ theory is from Louis Pasteur onwards. I mean, the vaccine for rabies was discovered, and then the discovery of bacteria happened, and then it was established that these small beings, these small creatures, could actually impact human body and its working. So from that point onwards, so from 1850 onwards, you have a different kind of germ theory. The idea of a germ was proposed even by Aristotle. So but that is they were trying to fabulate it. They were trying to bring a hypothesis that there might be something in the air that causes the disease. And the air, malaria, for instance, the etymology is basically mal air, bad air. So the bad air because something is there. The idea that something could be there in the air, that something could be there in plague. I mean, the miasma theory of plague is again a great example. Whoever asked this question. So you have, like for instance, it was not identified that rats were responsible for spreading plague. You see, it was thought to be some inherent problem with the human life that brings out something like plague, the infection of plague. Let us my answer is, let us not confuse the pre-19th century germ theory with the post-19th century germ theory. The post-19th century germ theory, with the help of microscopes, with the help of vaccine, that is what we usually refer to when we say the advancement of germ theory. That's my answer to that question, whoever asked it. Thank you for the question anyways.
So that was Ninu Thomas.
Yeah, Ninu Thomas. Thanks, Ninu Thomas.
Okay, so the next question is, why is that the epidemic of influenza of 1918 has not been properly reflected in literature, especially in the literature of the USA? Question from Gunjan Chaturvedi.
Yeah, see, I said in the beginning itself, I said literature is not duty bound to write about something that happens in society. Now, how many major writers can you actually show as have already come out with a poem or a major fiction about a pandemic, the COVID-19? People have no, right? And for that matter, why wouldn't people write about Spanish flu? Spanish flu was almost like this. During Spanish flu, theaters were shut down, quarantines were implemented, masks were worn. Spanish flu was like the trailer of Corona. Spanish flu was, I would say, if you use that, I'm not like trying to make a joke out of this, but still, I find it as a teaser or a trailer. Whatever happened during the outbreak of Spanish flu is happening globally now. People were wearing masks, shutting down of theaters happened, shutting down of markets happened. More than 3 or 5 people, coming together, that's being banned. So, when a certain disease, when a certain outbreak of a disease happens in certain place, the responsibility to record it lies with the medical discourse, lies with history, medical anthropology. That is where it really lies. Literature revisits it. Literature doesn't visit it. Literature always revisits. The new NEW is always the new KNEW in as far as literature is concerned. So for literature, any pandemic, any epidemic will be basically a revisiting of certain kernel metaphors that has already been in use. I mean, in the case of COVID, for instance, you will have to cross-refer to what happened in SARS, what happened in plague. Like now we are, okay, look back at the presentation that we have just made. Now, I've been talking about TB, I've been talking about cancer, I've been talking about AIDS. Now, TB, cancer, AIDS, these are 3 very different diseases. They don't have much to do with COVID. But what we see is the human response to large-scale diseases. They have certain gradient angles. They have certain scales which tip together, and that set of tipping scales is what literature is interested in. So documenting the outbreak of influenza is not really the responsibility of literary writers. But that said, in 2021, somebody could actually come up with a path-breaking novel on the influenza outbreak in US. or 2030. Or somebody might have come up with a novel that talks about a pandemic like, look at Saramago's blindness. Saramago's blindness actually comes up in 1993. The translation comes up in 1995. So, 1995 or 6. So, I mean, if you bother to read Saramago now, what is Saramago trying to say? Saramago was describing a place of quarantine, a place where blind people, infected with this disease, people are quarantined. And then the governmental pressure, governmental neglect, you know, how easily and how nuancedly can we actually relate the world that has been drawn by Saramago completely in his imagination? We can link it up with the reality that we are living now. Now, how could he do that? How could he imagine quarantine? How could he imagine the governmental neglect? How could he imagine the necessity that the world feels to go forward despite the rising number of infections? Things that we are doing, things that we are dealing with in newspapers. Saramago was able to see that situation in his imagination. So what I'm trying to say is literature is kind of, in that sense, it's about those discourses. It is about about discourses which record realities. If I have answered you, Gunjan. Who was that question from? I thought
So
it
the
was
question
Gunjan.
was from Gunjan. Yes, yes.
Yeah. I think I
So
have
the
answered that question.
so the next question is your take on the role played by films in
So,
creating romanticized.
I didn't get you. What
So
was that?
so what's your take on the role played by films in creating romanticized, moralized notions about pandemic or diseases? Question by Shamili P. Shall I repeat the question?
Please.
So, your take on the role played by films in creating romanticized, moralized notions about pandemic or diseases?
Yeah, my take will be same. It's like a film or any work of art for that matter is not duty bound to record the reality of the disease as it is. The disease is not understood only as a medical reality by a film. When a film is made, like for instance, if somebody makes a film on cancer for that matter, the actual cancer discourse that is done in medical field may not appear at all as a component, in discussing the narrative of the film. The narrative of the film or the narrative of any literary work works out its own intrinsic moral universe. It only uses the disease as a trophy. Like when Saramago was giving us blindness, the story, blindness has also been made into a successful film for that matter. But I think Shamli's question basically is about how there is a certain, mysterious aura being supplied to diseases. When the doctor announces that this person is like you have that the breaking moment, like for instance when the doctor comes and announces, there is a suspense in one of the usual cliched scenes in most of the commercial movies is when people are waiting outside the operation theater and then the doctor comes out and slowly shakes his head or like says operation success. So you have that what do I say, this the films as narrative structures, they have this power and they can bank on the power of the suspenseful moment. Their point is not to present you the exact way in which operations are done or diseases are understood or diseases are categorized. That is not how the films work. And I don't think that is how films should work. I don't think that is how literature should work. You see, otherwise it will become a documentary, right? You can have a documentary on cancer and you can have a feature film on cancer. The feature film will have a totally different take on it. Documentary is bound to some kind of truth narrative, But the truth narrative is not something that is not going to discuss, like, circumscribe or kind of command the way in which a narrative film should work. Did you really mean this, or did you mean something else, Shamli? I think she's offline. Anyway, so this is my take on it. Is there another question?
Sir, good evening. I have a question. Shall I ask?
Of course you can.
Yeah. So good evening. I'm John from Coimbatore. I work in an arts and science college. First of all, I must thank for your wonderful presentation.
Hi,
It
John.
was
Yeah.
really,
What's
it
the
was really a presentation. It is not a question. I just I just like to know your understanding on this, because I have a lot of questions and queries in this. And see, in literature, we have seen so many pandemics mentioned. And in Bible also, there are a lot of foretelling, like particularly in the Revelation, so many things are foretold. So how do you relate this? Do you really believe in the second coming of Christ, or how do you think about this?
See, in most of the Semitic religions, the end of the world is proclaimed by outbreak of diseases. Disease is the department of divinity as far as foundational texts are concerned for any Semitic religion, and not just Semitic religion, even in pre-Semitic religions, in pagan mythologies. As I have told you, smallpox is a goddess. So this thing happens in the theological realm. If you look at it, diseases are usually understood as supplied, regulated by God. So because God manages the earth in that paradigm, in that setup, God is in command of all those things. So naturally, the God decides which city should be destroyed by plague, which city should be destroyed by locusts. The wrath of God is made visible through diseases. So this is the theological setup. And about the second coming and all, definitely, I mean, if you look at WBH commenting on it, or any number of paperless texts that had come out in history, you would find that they all have references to diseases. So disease is still understood in the theological circle as distributed by, commanded by, dispensed by gods. But well, when you come to the non-theological circles that talk about, like science fiction, for instance, science fiction will not look at disease as something that, very famously, you have this novel by H.G. Wells, Wars of the World, where aliens attack the earth, and everything that the governments on earth had in their possession, every weapon fails against the aliens. But at last what happens is these aliens are infected by a bacteria, and the aliens have no defense against bacteria, and the aliens die. Now that is H.G. Wells' War of the World. So you see that germs are understood as, the gods did not help, the germs helped. That happens in science fiction. The other thing happens in theological fiction. So literature works in many ways. God works in mysterious ways. Literature also does that. So that's my take on it.
Yes, of course. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
So can we take another question, or are we concluding?
If it is a very relevant question, of course.
Yeah, we'll take one last question, sir. So, sir, is it right to read the connection of diseases or pandemic with divinity or God still dominates our cultural domain?
Your voice is breaking. Can you repeat that once again?
Sorry, sir. So, is it right to read the connection of the disease or pandemic with divinity or God still dominates our cultural domain?
That is almost the answer that I gave to John. Now, at a point in history where diseases were not, there was no way in which they could understand disease at that point of time when they wrote, say, the Bible or any other foundational text. So the writer of Iliad or the writer of Mahabharata or we can't say writers because they did not write, they were telling stories. So people who told the stories in Iliad, people who told the stories in Mahabharata, or people who told the stories in, say, Torah or earlier versions of Jewish Bible, they looked at diseases as basically God sent. How do you understand otherwise? When somebody falls ill and there is no cure, there is no way you can cure them. Cures were not developed. So like snakes become gods, fire become a god, flood becomes a god, when water becomes a god, thunder becomes a god, because these were realities that people were not able to crack. So when there is a reality that people are not able to understand, there is always a mystery, a sort of mystery, a sort of a darkness, nebulousness, surrounding it. Why is there a mystery around cancer now? Because there is a way in which science is not able to cure cancer completely. Science is not able to find answers to cancer completely. So the moment answer to cancer comes, cancer will be something like smallpox. We'll put it behind. Like how we put behind TB, like how we put behind smallpox, like how we put behind leprosy, we'll also put behind cancer and AIDS. So when the cure comes, when the medicine comes, when there is a perfect understanding of how this begins and how this can be ended, then the mystery surrounding the disease is lost. And the cultural associations slowly become part of our cultural mythology. It doesn't become a cultural reality. Is that okay? I mean, that is how I would take that question.
Thank you so much, sir. Now I'd like to invite Sister Mercy, Faculty of English, Don Bosco Arts and Science College, for the vote of thanks. Over to you, sister.
Good evening, one and all. We have had an excellent and interesting presentation by our resource person, Dr. Arunlal Mokeri, on pandemic and cultural lockdowns from different dimensions and perspectives. We have often heard that some rocks become diamonds and others become dust under severe pressure. During your presentation, sir, you made us ponder over this reality. Pandemic has helped people to develop their perspectives about this pandemic. People have experienced pandemic in the past, and you have illustrated with examples of literary figures and others. Some people have responded with write-ups and poems, even when they were in proximity with death. Scientists are on the way or have discovered vaccine and are experimenting to fight the COVID. It is also an occasion to atone for our sins and to confront the divine intervention. So, we wish that you will transcend and transform the situation into a positive energy, even if we have to be in quarantine. So we are never defeated, but can rise like the phoenix from the ashes. Sir, we would like to thank you for this informative and wonderful presentation. In the name of the management, our principal, Dr. Father Francis Karakat, and the Department of English, headed by Sarad Krishnan, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Vasu. So I'll check out. Yes, Mr. Continue.
I would like to thank all the participants who responded to our invitation and graced this presentation with their graceful presence. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you, sister. Participants, please fill in the feedback form. You'll be getting the certificate within 2 to 3 days. Thank you.
So Anagha, I can log out, right? This is done.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Hello.
Hello, Ms. Anaka.
miss?
I believe the link is not working for the feedback forms.
Sorry, miss. We'll do one thing. We'll try it again, or else we'll provide the link in our WhatsApp group. Is that fine?
Yeah, fine. Thank you.
Thank you.